Flipping the elementary classroom, ideas for doing an in-class flip with young learners. This presentation is based off lessons taught by Allie Lederer and Jess Weaver, first grade teachers at Joppa View Elementary. What is a flipped classroom? Well, we're all used to seeing the classroom you see on the left, where you give a lecture at school, and then the homework that night is practice for the skill that they learned in school that day. With a flipped classroom, you're actually giving the lecture as homework, whether it be a video or a screencast for the students to watch, so that the following day when the students come to school, they're ready to spend that class time practicing and doing that homework piece. When you have young students, it's difficult to assign that type of homework. You really need a lot of parent involvement, and obviously you need access to the technology. So if you don't have either one of those things, an option for you might be an in-class flip. And I'm going to show you a couple different ways that I've used in-class flips in my classroom. Why would you want to flip a lesson? When you flip a lesson, there's a lot less time spent in whole group, and there's a lot more time spent in small group. So since you're not going to be doing that lecture piece as a whole group with all of your students, there's a lot more time for them to be practicing and applying what they know, and for you to be facilitating and helping them. There's a lot more time for them to be in small groups and you to differentiate for those small groups and really giving the students what they actually need. There's 3 different ways that I've used the in-class flip method in my classroom, and these are the 3 ways that I will be sharing with you today. As elementary school teachers, we spend a lot of our time giving directions and repeating them over and over and over, and modeling activities for our students to do. So what I started doing to save me some time was recording myself giving directions, whether it be a screencast or a video. I would record myself reading directions, and I'd give my students the video to watch on their own. So what you see here is an example of a screencast that I made, explaining the directions for a phonics activity that I wanted my students to do and modeling the activity for them. This way I just gave my students the screencast to watch on their own on their devices, and it really saved me time because if a student was unclear on the directions or forgot a part of their directions, all they had to do was go back and watch the video again or watch that certain part over again. They didn't have to come up to me and ask me to repeat it. So I really saved myself the time that I would have taken to give directions and repeat them. And that gives you more time in your lesson block to meet with students and meet with small groups and do what you need to do. In my classroom, we use stations a lot. We use stations in math and sometimes in phonics too. So you can incorporate a flipped lesson by using stations. And what you see here is an example of what stations might look like in my classroom. I usually have 4 stations going. 2 of them would be practice activities, whether we're practicing the skill that we're learning that day or practicing a skill that we've learned in the past. One of the stations would be the flipped station, and then one would be teacher time. And with that flip station, that's where students will be watching the lecture, whether it be a screencast or video or PowerPoint. That's where they're getting the lecture piece so that by the time they come to you for teacher time, they've already gotten the lecture and they're ready to start practicing. Now with this model, I would usually start with my highest group at teacher time first because they're not always the group that would necessarily need to see that lecture piece in the flip station. I might just give them a very quick lesson and we can start practicing. So that's what I did this past year, but if you look on the in-class flip website that you're on, there's also another video where a teacher describes a different way to incorporate a flipped lesson in stations, and she explains a way to do it so that all students go to that flipped station before coming to you. So it's something to check out if you're interested in doing stations. I'm going to show you an example of how I used morning work to do an in-class flip. In my classroom, we have 30 to 35 minutes in the morning where my students come in, they do journal first, and then they do their morning work. And so with flipping a lesson, instead of assigning that lecture piece as homework, you can assign it as morning work for that day. So I'm going to show you an example of a lesson I did where I assigned to the lecture piece as morning work. This lesson was taught the second to last week of school, and it was a lesson on money, specifically counting nickels and identifying nickels. So this day for morning work, my students had to read through a PowerPoint that taught them the attributes of a nickel, how much it's worth, and how to count nickels, and complete the worksheet you see on the left. At the top of the worksheet, there are directions for accessing the PowerPoint. I would usually save the PowerPoint under the student drive for my students to access on their device. And then they had to, after reading through the PowerPoint, record 2 things that they learned about the nickel. And then if they still had a question for me, they could record a question. This PowerPoint I put together myself. It was very quick and easy to do. I just put a couple slides about nickels with text and images. But you can also find PowerPoints to use for something like this online just by Googling whatever skill you're doing, whatever grade level you're teaching. What's great about PowerPoint is if you have students who have difficulty reading independently or reading on their own, in PowerPoint you can insert audio recordings, so you can record yourself reading each slide of the PowerPoint and your students can just listen rather than reading it on their own. By the time we got to math this day, I knew that my students had already learned a few things about the nickel, hopefully, and were ready to start practicing. So in order to make sure that they were ready to start practicing, I gave them a pre-assessment to see what they had already learned from the PowerPoint. So there's a lot of different tools you can use to pre-assess. I'm going to show you 2 tools that we've used. SoccerTip on the left is what the little boy in the video is doing. That's a tool that you can use if your students have devices. And Plickers on the right is a tool that you can use if your students do not have devices. So these are 2 great tools to use because they give you instant feedback, and I think that's probably the most important aspect of a pre-assessment tool, so that you can immediately group your students and you can immediately identify what your students need in that lesson. SoccerTip is a free website for teachers to use to create quizzes for their students to take. So what you see here is what it looks like from a student's perspective. Teachers create quizzes online. You can create multiple choice questions, short answer questions, true and false. And after you create your quiz, it gives you a room code that you give your students to enter at the login screen. So after your student enters the room code, they type in their name and then they start taking the quiz. This was actually the exact pre-assessment quiz that I gave my students for the nickel lesson. And what's cool about SoccerTip is when you create the quiz, it also allows you to add an explanation for students if they get the answer incorrect. So if they answered a question correctly, it would pop up that they got it wrong, but it would also pop up with an explanation of why they got it wrong and what the correct answer actually was. I didn't do that for this quiz, but SoccerTip does allow you that option. So this was just the quick 5-question nickel pre-assessment that I gave my students. After your students complete the SoccerTip quiz, SoccerTip allows you to download a couple different types of reports. You can see up top the 3 different reports that you can get. It'll give you a file of each individual student report. It will allow you to access a class Excel sheet of the quiz, and then it'll give you a PDF breakdown of each question. So what you see here is the Excel sheet of the results, and I immediately can see which students I would need to put in my intervention group, which is the most important part. So I'm able to tell which students need the intervention and which students are ready to just start practicing with nickels. And you can see here a lot of my students are ready to start practicing, so I now know that this is an okay lesson to flip because not all my students need that lecture from the teacher. They did okay with the lecture on their own. They're ready to start practicing. But I do see that 5 or 6 of my students might need an independent lecture from me, and that's what I'll address with that group and small group. Plickers is another pre-assessment tool that gives you instant feedback, and this is a tool you can use if you don't have a lot of technology in your classroom. All you need is a set of the Plickers cards you see the students holding on the left, and a smartphone so that you can download the app. How it works is you assign each student a card, and on the card are the letters A, B, C, and D, and the student has to hold the card so that the letter that they want to answer is on top of the card that they're holding. So when you use your phone, you hit the camera button on the app that you see on the right, and it will scan. You just scan each card, and it's almost like a QR code, and it will pick up the answer that your student is answering. So it's hard to explain, but if you search for Plickers and you search for a tutorial, it'll show you how it works. But it also gives you the instant feedback that you would need to group your students for that lesson. After grouping my students, we were able to start stations, and these were the 4 stations I had set up for that lesson that day. I had 2 games, I had a teacher small group, and I had a Wixie station. Apple Bump is a free game that I found online on Teachers Pay Teachers. This practiced skipped counting by 5s. How it works is the students roll 2 dice. They add the 2 numbers together, and then they count by 5s that many times. And then whatever number they end up with is the number they cover on their board. So the students had been practicing skip counting by 5s all year, and they had played this game several times before. But I thought it was important to play this game because when you count nickels, you're essentially counting by 5s. So the more practice they have counting by 5s, the better they will be at counting nickels. This nickel game is another game that I found for free on Teachers Pay Teachers. How it works is the students roll a dice that's labeled 1 through 3. That after they roll the dice, they pick up that many pennies. And when they collect 5 pennies on their board, they're able to trade in their pennies for 1 nickel. And by the end of the game, whoever has the most nickels wins. This game helps the students understand that 5 pennies is equivalent to 1 nickel. My small group that day was different for each group. Depending on what I saw that they needed based on the pre-assessment results is what I did with them. So my intervention group, I knew that they needed just practice with identifying nickels and talking about how much 1 nickel's worth and counting nickels by counting by 5s. So that's what I did with my intervention group, whereas the other groups, I knew that they had already shown me that they know how to count nickels, so they were ready to start counting nickels and pennies together and adding them together, which is why I have pennies available on the table as well. So it all depends on what the students needed based on the pre-assessment results. The last station was a Wixie project that I had made. On this first page of the Wixie project, the students were circling the nickels that they could find on the page. The next couple pages was counting nickels and recording the amount. And then the last couple pages were having the students drag nickels and pennies to create a certain amount. What's great about Wixie is you can also record your voice reading instructions for each page so that the students can just listen to the directions and complete the page on their own. You don't really need a teacher there reading directions for them. It's also great because at the end of the day, I can access each student's completed project and see how they did on it. So if I, at the end of this lesson, looked at their Wixie project and saw that a certain student didn't do too well on each page, I can meet with them the next day and address the needs. After each group visited each station, I gave my students a post-assessment. And the post-assessment was actually the same exact nickel quiz on SoccerTip that I gave for the pre-assessment. You can give a quiz more than once. So it really showed me how much the students had learned throughout that lesson. It also was great because I was able to tell what students maybe needed a little more practice the following day. So in the post-assessment results, you can see there were 4 students who still had trouble counting nickels and pennies together. So I might want to pull it following day, I might want to pull those 4 students in a small group to practice that skill to help them. So that's a flipped math lesson that I've done. I'm going to show you a quick example of an in-class flipped reading lesson. This reading lesson was about asking and answering questions, and the morning work that day was very similar to the morning work of the nickel lesson. I had my students accessing a PowerPoint and completing a worksheet. So the PowerPoint that I made for this day, I put in a couple slides about how to ask questions while you read, and then I actually took pictures from my Wonders book that we have access to through BCPS 1. I snipped in pictures from the book in each page, and I covered the words so that the students were taking a picture walk. I just wanted the students to look at the pictures so that they could ask questions based on the pictures. So I copied and pasted the pictures into the PowerPoint so my students didn't have to go from the PowerPoint to Wonders to BCPS 1. It was a little too much, so I took the pictures from Wonders and I put them into the PowerPoint. So the students had to take the picture walk and record 3 questions that they had about the story just by looking at the pictures. And then after recording 3 questions that they had to choose one of those questions to post on a Padlet wall. And at this point, my students had used Padlet a lot, so they were able to use it independently. So after asking the 3 questions, they had to choose one to post on the Padlet wall. And if you want more information on Padlet, you can just Google search Padlet. It's very easy to use, but essentially it's just an online bulletin board for students to post things and other students can see it. So by the time we got to reading that day, my students had already gotten the whole group part that I would have done with them if I had done a normal lesson that wasn't flipped. So they were immediately ready to start their partner work. So partner work this day was, the directions were to actually read the story, read the words, and answer the questions from the Padlet wall. So with reading the story, I usually gave my students the option of listening to it online or actually reading the book. I did have hard copies of the book if they would like to read it instead. But they had to read it with their partner, and then they had to go back to that Padlet wall and choose 3 questions that were posted on the wall to answer. So they had to write the name of the friend who asked the question and record the answer to the question. Independent work that day was very similar to every other day. The students had to read their leveled reader books from Wonders and practice the skill on their own. So this day they were reading their leveled books and asking questions before, during, and after reading. So this was a 90-minute reading block where my students were working in partners and working on their own. So the teacher was more of the facilitator during this lesson. I was able to pull small groups. I was able to meet with individual students, whatever my students needed that day. If I had looked at the Padlet wall and I saw maybe a student wasn't asking a question, they were telling me a statement rather than asking a question, I would meet with them, pull them into a small group, and just work on statements versus questions. Or if I saw that students could have been asking better questions, I'd pull those students in a small group and work on different ways of asking better questions. So really whatever I know that my students needed that day is what I would be doing in small group, but it really allows me a lot more time to work in small group and less time doing that whole group piece with them because I did it as morning work that day. When you're deciding whether or not to flip a lesson, I think it's important to choose lessons that you know your students will be successful with. I chose these 2 lessons to flip because the nickel lesson, my students had been counting money every day in calendar math the whole year, so they had already had practice with counting money, so I knew that they had a little background with it. And with the questioning lesson, we had been doing questioning a lot throughout the year, so I know that they already knew how to ask questions and how to answer questions, so I knew that they would be successful with it. But I would never choose a challenging lesson to flip, or if it's a skill that I know my students really haven't had exposure to, I wouldn't flip that, because sometimes your students really need that whole group, and most of your students need that lecture part. So it depends on what the skill is. Obviously, you don't need to flip a lesson every day. Just pick the days that you would like to spend more time in small groups so that those would be lessons that you would want to flip. So I hoped that helped you, and I hope that you can use maybe some of these ideas and apply them to your